Privit, Salut from Bucharest in Romania. And many comments under my recent videos have been asking me, will Putin stop with an invasion of Ukraine if he wins militarily in Ukraine? Or will he keep going into other countries in Europe or maybe somewhere else in the world? So I want to just address that. Let's go through some of the countries. First of all, here in the center of Bucharest, I don't think they need to be too concerned. This is way, way down on Putin's menu of countries to invade after Ukraine. But let's start with the most likely. That is neighboring Moldova, where people in general, the majority speak Romanian, although it has a big Russian-speaking population. Now, that is particularly vulnerable for several reasons. Let's start with the government. The current government in Chisinau is pro-EU. They actually, earlier this week, applied for EU candidacy. By the way, I'm making this video on day 10 of the Russian invasion, which is, my watch says the 5th of March 2022. So they want to join the EU. Now, they didn't say that they want to join NATO, but for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really matter. They're definitely trying to leave Russia's orbit. Already there are Russian troops in the country, in the breakaway region of Transnistria, which is a tiny sliver of territory that borders with Ukraine. And there are Russian peacekeepers there. We don't know exactly how many Russian soldiers are actually there, but there's a lot. And probably Transnistrian troops as well would assist in any Russian attempt to control other parts. So the first scenario is that Russia just, if they manage to take the south of Ukraine, that would create a contiguous territory with Transnistria, and they would just also nab Transnistria, where probably local people, definitely local authorities, would even be in favor of that. Would they stop in Transnistria, though? The Moldovan military is particularly weak. Now, I'm not a military expert, but they couldn't defeat the Transnistrians back in the 90s, who had help from the Russian forces. And they don't seem to have much of a military, definitely compared to the Ukrainians, they don't. And they haven't been armed by the West because it hasn't been, in play or a big deal up until now. That might change, of course. So that makes it probably the most tempting for him to go and try and nab. It wouldn't be so difficult. He could probably overrun it in a few days, the rest of the country. So also the Transnistrian force may assist on an invasion of southern Ukraine like Odessa because, well, Belarusian President Lukashenko in his wisdom had on TV a map where it showed a line coming out, but that was pretty obvious anyways that was part of the plan, which wasn't implemented from the very beginning to attack Odessa, which is interesting. I mean, they went on, I guess, 4 flanks, but they didn't make the 5th out of Transnistria as yet. On top of that, there's another area in Moldova called Gagauzia, where the people are Gagauz. It's a Turkic ethnicity. And those people tend to be more pro-Russian than the rest of the Moldovan population. And there's even a clause in the Moldovan constitution that if Moldova were to unify with Romania, then they would get a referendum to secede and actually leave, the new Romania that would include Moldova. So probably there, Russia would have some local support. Yeah, the central government wants to join the EU. So I guess if they didn't change that policy, then that would be definitely a risk that Russia would go for Moldova after Ukraine. Now, other places that are on the menu, the shopping list, those would be Georgia, because you have the 2 separatist republics of South Ossetia, where Russia intervened in 2008, and Abkhazia. So there are already Russian forces there, so I guess they could, Russia recognizes their independence, so I guess they could annex those. I'm not really sure what the strategic benefit would be to annexing those 2 territories, but they could, I guess, and just formally take them. Going into the rest of Georgia, I think they made a lot of resistance, but Georgia also applied for EU candidacy status last week. So, if the government in Tbilisi didn't change its policy, then maybe there would be a risk of an invasion there. Obviously, Russia borders it, so they already beat the Georgians in a war back in 2008, where they didn't have to even send out many troops, the Russians. I don't know if the Georgian military has improved dramatically, but there hasn't been the same coverage of investment into their military. So it would be a risk, but probably a lot less than Moldova for sure. Now, other places that are a risk would be, let me think, where to start. Well, we have the Baltic states, and I guess we got to talk about the Suwałki Gap, which goes out from Belarus to Kaliningrad. And that's a small piece of territory between, on the border between Lithuania and Poland, that separates them. So they could be joined up, made a contiguous territory if Russia were to seize that. Now, the big issue, of course, when we start talking about the Baltics or Poland is they are in NATO, so any attack on those countries would they could invoke Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which means that basically the other member states like the US and UK would be obliged to intervene and actually militarily attack any Russian forces that were there. We basically have World War III, potentially, so I don't think that's very likely, but they could seize Gotland Island, which is part of Sweden, in the Baltics, and Sweden is not a NATO member, now it is part of the EU, and the other EU members are supposed to come to their defense, but would France and Germany intervene militarily to kick the Russians out of Gotland? I don't know, and the US would not be actually obliged. So that's a possibility, and from there then they could launch some attacks on the Baltic states like Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania that were part of the Soviet Union and now become independent. Those three states are part of NATO, so again, Article 5, but for example, if Russia were to use the little green men, like in Crimea, just these guys show up with guns in declaring some People's Republic in Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, where there are concentrations of ethnic Russians or Russian speakers, then it might be, they have plausible deniability, although everyone would know that they're Russian troops. So that is a possibility, but I think there's huge risk in that those countries would activate Article 5 and then you'd have the US involved. So I don't think that's very likely. Other countries that need to be concerned are Kazakhstan. Now, Russia actually intervened when there was some civil disturbances in Kazakhstan, I guess about a month ago at this stage, maybe a bit more than a month ago. And the current leader, Tokayev, has consolidated his power with the help of Russia. So I don't think they have particularly bad relations at the moment. But the north of Kazakhstan has a lot of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. Used to have a lot of ethnic Germans before as well. And there's a lot of resources there. So that is a possibility, but if they have good relations with Kazakhstan or the new leadership in Kazakhstan, that's unlikely to happen. It's a bit like Belarus from that point of view. So who are we left with? With Finland, which is not a member of NATO, which is threatening to join NATO, same with Sweden, or considering it now, because they feel threatened by Russia's new invasion of Ukraine, that they feel, well, we need basically to have that security umbrella from the US, because just being a member of the EU, like Finland is, means that you're basically going to be dependent on defending yourself, in conjunction maybe France and Germany being the big states that might help you. But again, I made my first video on this conflict in December in Kharkiv, and I told a story about how I met the former Estonian president, Leonid Meri, back in Washington, D.C. It was like in 2003, 2004. And he told me that one of the reasons that he had led Estonia to join NATO was because he didn't believe that if Russia invaded Estonia, that the French and Germans would come to protect them. So definitely there's a concern about that, long-standing. And Finland has a very long border with Russia. They fought wars with the Soviet Union and Russia. It was part of the Russian Empire for a while. It wasn't very heavily Russified, but with the Winter War, they lost some territory to the Soviet Union, and they're the current borders basically today, where that agreement after the Winter War. But they did put up valiant resistance to the Soviets' invasion at the time, and I guess they have that fighting spirit along their eastern border. But they would be concerned, but again, they'd probably just look at joining NATO if there really was a big risk of a Russian invasion on Finland. So if I've covered everywhere at this stage, that's probably a risk. Yeah, I've covered everywhere. That was on my list about where, I mean, obviously if they were to plow their way through those countries, then Russia would just look at the next target, but it's taking them so long. We're already on day 10 of the invasion of Ukraine, the new invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and things are, in spite of what President Putin tried to say last night, they are not going to plan, and there's a lot of local resistance, and I have no idea how they plan to occupy a country as big as Ukraine with a population that is definitely not welcoming them with flowers, that's taking so much material, and potentially more soldiers. They nearly have all their 200,000 soldiers that were on the border already in Ukraine. I have no idea, other than maybe making a beeline for Moldova afterwards, how they can go anywhere else. It just seems like this has been a very expensive and costly endeavor, invading Ukraine in the first place, that probably all those other countries, bar Moldova, can probably sleep soundly when they go to sleep tonight. I guess everybody in those countries should definitely be grateful for the bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian military so far. We have no idea how things are going to end in the conflict, but definitely 10 days was a lot longer than most military analysts from the West that I saw before the invasion thought they would last for. A lot of them were talking about 3 days and Kiev would fall, but we're on day 10 and doesn't look likely now in the immediate, looking forward immediately now, right? Not today or tomorrow. I can't really look further than that. So, дуже дякую, Українська армія. Slava Ukraina, Harun Slava.
SAR Experience.